The way I look at it, President Trump has always looked at tariffs as a hammer. You know, they say when you have all you have is a nail, all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. During an FTA negotiation, you can protect the king, you can protect the queen, maybe the knight, but you have to sacrifice a few pawns here and there.
Yeah.
And that's what I think has also been the case in the India-UK FTA. Now, we call ourselves the pharmacy of the world. But we need to understand that we've never discovered a molecule.
Do you think Donald Trump has some hidden strategic genius when it comes to handling China and the world trade? Or do you think he's just being the bully that he is?
The government took a wise decision of walking out of RCEP, which was basically an FTA with China, giving them access to 80% of our trade lands and trade value, and which would have meant the death knell of industrial sectors. A number of them are Chinese, have the scale, they have the clout, and they have established industry and product.
समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया.
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
आप समझा.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In January this year, India's exports stood at $36.4 billion, while imports surged to an astonishing $720 billion. You know, as a country aspires to become the world's third largest economy, there is a renewed push towards bilateral free trade agreements. Two key FTAs are currently in the spotlight. One, recently signed with the United Kingdom, signed a day before the launch of Operation Sindoor, and another expected soon with the United States. Closer home, negotiations with the European Union for a long negotiated FTA is also being inching forward, and perhaps the FTA is likely to be finalized soon. But here's the concern. Past FTAs, especially those with ASEAN countries and Japan, have resulted in significant trade deficits for India. There are also rising apprehensions about the sluggish pace of foreign investments and whether the much discussed China plus one strategy, or the diversification away from China, is actually playing out. Most crucially, every FTA must be a balanced win-win proposition. However, our experience has shown that FTAs have given favorable terms to our partners while keeping our benefits intangible. And we can argue if this is a correct reading or not. So what's in it for India in these new trade deals with the UK and the one that we are now about to sign with the US in a few months, especially amid today's charged global political climate? To help us navigate the nuances of trade diplomacy and decode India's complex trade ecosystem, I'm joined by a very special guest. Please welcome Ambassador J.S. Deepak, India's former chief negotiator for the RCEP, the India-EU FTA negotiations, and our former ambassador to the WTO. If there's one person who has been there and done that and seen it all, it's him. Currently, he is Group Director at Bharti Enterprises, and Ambassador Deepak brings a deep insider perspective on high-stakes trade negotiations. Without further ado, let's start this episode of WorldView with Swasti with Ambassador J.S. Deepak. So what a pleasure it is to be joined by Ambassador J.S. Deepak in studio today. Thanks for taking the time out and joining us here and talking about something which requires much more attention than it's getting, for obvious reasons, because the entire country has been watching the Operation Sindoor, etc., etc. But if I just start with the most obvious question, just before all this started, Donald Trump really took the world by storm when on April 2nd, the Liberation Day, he just seemed to levy tariffs after tariffs on almost everybody. And then he found out this very strange formula, based on which he had found out those tariffs. But then enough has been said about it, but it so seemed that the world forgot about it because then national security became more important. But now we know that we have to ready a trade deal with the United States. On the other hand, there is a recently signed FTA with the UK, and there is an ongoing one with the EU. So India seems to be in the thick of negotiating and readying a lot of free trade agreements. But very quickly, where do you think Donald Trump is getting these ideas from? Because he's not really seeming to get away with it.
Let's step back a bit. The rules-based system of global trade, anchored by the WTO, has, for the last 30 years and more, held us in good stead. It's prevented trade wars, it's kept markets open, it's provided consumer choice of products, companies stable rules for investments, and countries have been able to leverage trade for growth. Donald Trump, when he came into his first term, started the trade war in 2017. And then that was time when, sitting in Geneva, we were aghast that someone could so arbitrarily and so aggressively break all the commitments made at the WTO. Whether it's commitment of the ceiling on bound tariffs, which the US had given, or non-discriminatory treatment, etc.
Right.
The way I look at it, President Trump has always looked at tariffs as a hammer. They say when you have all you have is a nail, all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So he's using this very blunt, I would say, 20th century tool to address a 19th century issue of trade deficit.
Okay.
And he makes a preposterous demand, negotiates a deal. He may get 5 or 10% of what he asked for, and then declares victory.
Yeah.
And so now we have the second trade war, which is even more magnified and bigger, and against everybody in the world, both his allies and adversaries.
Yeah, true. In that respect, he's been the chief disruptor anyway, because he has treated his allies worse than he's treated his rivals so far.
Yes.
Yeah. So very quickly then, Ambassador Deepak, I mean, you have been in the thick of things. You have been India's, you've been the chief negotiator for RCEP. You've been the chief negotiator also for the EU-India FTA, which is still ongoing. You've been at the WTO. You were our ambassador at the WTO. So you know the insider story. Now, very quickly, let me just come back right now to the most latest FTA that has been signed, which is between India and the UK. Should we be happy about it? Should we be worried about it? Or should we just wait for the details to come out?
India's preference has always been multilateral trade agreements. But because the WTO has not been able to deliver, we call it paralysis at the WTO, consensus by exhaustion, because 165 countries cannot decide anything and decisions there are taken by consensus.
Right.
So FTAs have become important. Now, economists through the ages, I mean, from Milton Friedman down to the last person, have been unanimous in believing that free trade is good for the economy, for creation of jobs and wealth. Therefore, trade agreements between countries can be win-win.
Okay.
They can be like the incoming tide which lifts all boats. And so I hope our agreements, which India is getting into. So there is a great opportunity, but there are great concerns.
Okay.
At the WTO, you have the cover of coalitions. You have principles like special and differential treatment, which give additional benefits to developing countries like India, which are not there in bilateral negotiations. And in bilaterals, you can also be arm twisted. I mean, India is now a large power, economic power. But still, I mean, you're dealing with powers which are many times bigger than yours. So there is a risk of being arm twisted.
Yeah, but I'm asking this because at the outset, and just spending a little bit more time on the India-UK FTA. Of course, this is UK's first FTA after Brexit, and in quick succession, then they've had another one with the US, etc. But just focusing on ours, of course, the Conservatives also tried that. If you remember, Rishi Sunak had also ceremoniously announced that they will try to have it by Diwali. It couldn't happen, a couple of years ago. But now it's happened in May, I think first week of May, if I'm not wrong. And the first news that came about it was that Indians are going to get cheap whiskey and gin and all of that. But that cannot really take the trade forward. And about our industrial goods going there seems to be a window of 10 years where we feel that we can penetrate in a decent enough manner into their markets. And also, what worries me is that we do not see any promise, or we do not see any conditionality for getting investments into India.
Yeah, so you've raised a number of points. Let me start with the content of the FTA.
Right.
Now, the government of India has not made the text public.
Why?
I suppose it's being scrubbed and it still has to be signed. We are at a stage where it has been agreed between.
Okay.
So maybe the approval processes, legal scrubbing, the fine print has to get placed and so on and so forth. And this can take a few months. FTAs to use, involve give and take. These are negotiations.
Right.
To use an analogy from chess, during an FTA negotiation, you can protect the king, you can protect the queen, maybe the knight, but you have to sacrifice a few pawns here and there.
Yeah.
And that's what I think has also been the case in the India-UK FTA. It's clear that we are getting some market access in important areas.
Okay.
Textiles and clothing is one of them.
Right.
We get a level playing field because we were subject to tariffs in the UK, and our competitors like Bangladesh, which was in LDC, and Vietnam and others had zero tariff access. So it gives us, our companies, a level playing field, reduction of tariffs even up to 16%. That's certainly a gain. We also get certain benefits for small cars, tariff benefits,
Yeah.
for carpets and handicrafts and such kinds of produce, which is good, and certain agriculture items as well. There are three areas where we have made concessions, which
Okay.
perhaps we have not done in any FTA of this size.
Okay.
One is the auto industry. We're reducing tariffs from 100% to 10% over a period of time. Now, this has been part of the India-EU negotiations for a long time, but there always was a tariff quota. You reduce tariff for a certain number of cars, a certain value of trade. I think the India-UK FTA also has that.
Okay.
I hope that it also has a capacity ceiling. Again, when we were negotiating with the EU, the tariff reduction was to be for cars, big cars, 1,500 cc or 2,000 cc plus,
Yeah.
because India is a hub of small cars.
Right.
Our auto industry is very important in the sense that 1/3 of all manufacturing is in the automotive sector.
Right.
So we need to protect it. And I hope they have put the ceiling of CC, the engine capacity,
Yeah.
as well as the tariff rate quota, which we hear is perhaps there. The other problem with the auto is that the concessions are also for infant industries like electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. Maybe that's something which
The Indian side
again,
would be very upset about that.
that's infant industry protection is required, and this is an area which Indian auto sector could grow.
Okay.
Again, we will know only from the fine print whether the tariff concessions for these kinds of cars are the same as there for the internal combustion cars.
Right. So these are the three areas that you would.
So this is automotives.
Yeah.
The second is the government procurement.
Okay.
We have about $600 billion worth of government procurement, which is 15% of GDP, large chunk. We reserve it under the Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc., for our enterprises and for MSMEs. This is for the first time. Our UAE, we had some GP, some concessions in government procurement.
Right.
But it is noteworthy that we have not signed the government procurement agreement at the WTO.
Okay.
So we have sensitivities. In this case, we are allowing UK companies with more than 20% holding to be treated like local suppliers.
Okay.
Global tendering for large tenders is a way to go, so that's not too much of a worry. But my concern is that 20% ceiling will allow a company, for say, which is 76 or 74% Chinese and 26% UK, to
Right.
also get the benefit of their local supplier and the repercussions that they have.
Yeah.
And the third area is the patents area.
Okay.
Pharmaceutical industry is a very important industry again, which we need to protect, both for exports and domestic. Now, we call ourselves the pharmacy of the world. But we need to understand that we've never discovered a molecule. We are basically good tablet makers, good formulation makers, cheap and efficient, which we sell here in 150 countries in the world. And we have had great achievements in the sense that Cipla India, when it came out with the triple cocktail in 2001, was responsible for the victory over the war against HIV/AIDS in Africa. So it's not to be scoffed at, but we have not discovered a molecule. What our companies do is they look at patents.
Okay.
If the patent for a drug, which is typically for 20 years, is expiring, they make a generic version.
Okay.
And then they are able to capture the market because they're very much lower priced. Now, the Europeans, the Americans, the developed countries, the Japanese have all been wanting to evergreen patents, what we call, to extend the life of patents beyond 20 years.
Yeah.
And if that is done by changes in our Patent Act, that would really affect pharmaceutical industry because it would delay the time when they could get into the particular drug with a generic formulation. So I don't know what the agreement related to IPRs is.
Okay.
I'm sure our Section 3D of the Patents Act, which prevents evergreening, and which is upheld by the Supreme Court,
Okay.
will stand, and there may be some minor concessions and process-related accommodations which we are making. But then again, we will know once the text is out.
And what is your reading on mobility? Because of course, I mean, when we look at our cumulative trade with the UK as it stands in 2024, both in goods and services, collectively this is about a $57 billion, and a large part of that is also services. So, do you see any clear iteration that the UK is going to be promoting Indian services there?
See, that is the problem we face in FTAs.
Yeah.
How to get a balance.
Yeah.
For our interlocutor, UK in this case, it's easy. We have higher tariffs. We have entitlements of higher tariffs, so they get the tariffs reduced and they get market access. What do we ask for to balance?
Exactly, yeah.
So that's often difficult, and that is a challenge for negotiators.
Yeah.
Now, most countries, whether it's UK, EU, or US, have negligible tariffs, 3-5% average tariff for our exports. So that's not much scope for it, except in areas like textiles and certain light engineering and agriculture goods. They are open in services as well. The regulations allow direct investment in service sectors as well as they provide national treatment. So there's not much to ask there.
Okay.
And with the backlash against globalization,
Yeah.
Which has resulted in Brexit, the narrative against migration, including of professionals and temporary workers, it's difficult to ask for visas and quotas.
Yeah.
So what do we ask for?
Yeah.
That becomes a challenge.
Then we ask for investments.
So, yeah, I mean, the ideal thing is to do a comprehensive trade agreement, which is both trade and investment, as we did with Korea and Japan.
Exactly, yeah.
But in this case, I think it's been done separately for procedural or reasons of remit. The DEA is doing one and the Commerce is doing others and so on. But ideally, we should have done it together because we are interested in investment and investment rides on trade. So there's a sense of doing it together. So what do we ask for? We ask for market access in certain areas, which we have. We are getting some reductions in tariffs for seafood, which is a major export to some removal of non-tariff barriers maybe. Some quotas for non-important professionals like yoga teachers and cooks and so on and so forth. But for our IT professionals, we are not getting a quota, an additional quota, sector-wise, etc.
Okay.
And we've got a good deal in the social security area, where our professionals will not have to make social security contribution for 3 years.
Okay.
So that's a benefit which similar benefit we've been fighting for in the US, not yet got, but that's the way to go.
Okay.
But market access for IT services, I don't think we've got anything additional.
All right.
So I trust and I hope that it is balanced. The give and the take is equal.
Yeah.
And of the $30 billion of exports of services and goods which we do, on $6 billion of goods we are getting reductions in duty. Some outcomes in services, especially the double contribution convention, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But we will be able to look at the balance of give and take once we have the text and the details of the agreement.
Right. And before I go further, because of course, there is a lot of speculation also around investments, because one of the things that is usually said is that the problem with our bilateral investment treaties that we are negotiating with many partners is that they want investment guarantees that India is not willing to provide, because India says that we subscribe by the WTO rules and they want anyway independent bilateral investment guarantees. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. Is that really a point of contention, or is it, what exactly is it that investments are not able to come? Because I ask you this question not only about the FTAs, Ambassador Deepak, but also that if you look at the financial years, like for example, the last financial year, now we actually earned more from remittances than we earned from FTIs, and FTIs has not been growing in proportion to our GDP. And there is a lot of times this link made that for becoming a manufacturing sector, really, we need the FTIs. We need the FTIs. So how do we sort of understand this investment puzzle?
See, investment is not a WTO issue. Our view is that WTO is about trade and investment is not a WTO issue.
Okay.
In bilaterals, comprehensive BTAs, we have been including both trade and investment. ASEAN, Korea, Japan, which were our big bilateral agreements. And we do need FDI. The stock of FDI in India, and Professor Kelkar has done this analysis, from 1997 to 2019 is about $460 billion.
Okay.
In the same period, China got $12.5 trillion, 25 times. So we need FDI.
Yeah.
But so there is no prohibition of having a comprehensive trade and investment agreement, no international rule or convention which prevents us from it. It's our internal issues.
Yeah.
We had certain bilateral investment treaties which caused us problems. Countries and companies took us to arbitration and got decisions against us. So we scrapped all of them. We have a bilateral model text which is very low ambition. No one wants to sign on to them.
Okay.
So it has to be a bespoke investment agreement, and to my mind, it should be part of FTAs, which we are not doing.
Yeah.
The other point which you raise, this when we do an FTA with any major country, the narrative in India is that it is increasing trade deficits. I see criticism that trade deficit with ASEAN has increased after the FTA, with Korea, with Japan.
Yeah.
Now, and this government, when it came to power, felt very strongly on that.
Yeah.
According to me, it's wrong to judge an FTA only by the metric of trade deficit. And let me tell you why.
Okay.
See, our other partners with whom we are doing FTAs have low tariffs. So the reduction in tariffs is less.
Right.
UK may have an average tariff of 3, 4, 5% for items which we export. We have average tariffs of 17, 20, 30%. So we will reduce tariffs more, they will reduce tariffs less.
Yes.
So obviously their goods exports will go up more, our goods exports will go less. So there the trade deficit will expand. This is the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
Whether it's ASEAN, whether it's Korea and Japan, trade deficit has gone up.
Yeah.
But that is not to say that these FTAs have not been good for our economy.
Okay.
Let me give you an example.
Okay.
Our best FTAs, according to me, were with Korea and Japan before the set which have been done. And that was not on the criteria of trade deficit. Trade deficit went up. But what the Koreans and Japanese did, they negotiated low or zero tariff for special steels.
Right.
They got robust investment promotion and protection measures as part of the FTA.
Okay.
They invested in the auto industry, expanded their companies, whether it was Honda or Toyota or Hyundai, etc. This made India a hub for small cars.
Right.
to cater to the domestic market and eventually export. Today, we export 7.5 lakh cars to Europe, which is not a small sum. And that's why the auto industry accounts for 1/3 of all manufacturing in India, and it's an important industry which you need to protect. Even with the UK or with US or anyone else, it is my view that trade deficits will go up.
Okay.
But that should not worry us. Both exports and imports are both good for the economy.
Yeah.
That's why we measure trade as a percentage of GDP.
Right.
It's a different matter that trade as a percentage of GDP has gone down from 56% in 2011 to about 40% in 2019. It's going up now.
Okay.
Exports create jobs in manufacturing. Imports provide choice of products to consumers and create jobs in services, banking, insurance, logistics, transportation, shipping, the works.
And-
So both are good. Unless you have a balance of payment problem, which we don't have,
Okay.
both exports and imports are good for the economy. So we should not be terribly worried about, India should not be terribly worried about trade deficit. We should be worried about market access, being able to get markets for products which we are competitive in.
Okay.
And there are a number of products which we are competitive in now.
Okay.
And this should be the way forward.
Yeah, so considering this template that you just told me about, that it's not just the trade deficit per se, and I mean, incidentally, it's also the fact that whether it's the UK or the US, these are partners with whom we already have a trade surplus. Okay, so this narrative is of importance. So once you strike the FTA, you might land up
yes.
reducing it, but it doesn't necessarily mean bad news for your economy per se. But there's also another FTA that we signed, Ambassador Deepak, which was just 2 years ago, and again with the European nations, with the non-EU countries, the 4 FTA countries, Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. That's called that was March 2023, and that also was touted as a major success because it was India's first FTA with the Western world, etc. And that was, when it came, it said that now this is going to sort of be as a catalyst for the ongoing negotiations between India and the EU on the one hand, India and UK on the other hand. What's your view of that? Because that seems to nail that quid pro quo, at least on the surface, that we opened our markets in lieu of about $100 billion worth of investments over the next 10-15 years. That was the promise. But how do you view that?
India has traditionally been conservative about FTAs. It's our colonial legacy, where we had a drain of wealth because of unfair trade rules, and we had a foreign exchange problem in the early years of independence.
Right.
And thirdly, because often the discussions are informed by the power relationship as well.
Right.
They say the golden rule for bilateral trade negotiations is that he who has the gold makes the rules. So it's challenging to do an FTA with powerful economies, including in Europe, including FTA. What happens usually, and how to get a balance? They generally ask for reduction of tariffs, which we are entitled to, our WTO committed tariffs, bound tariffs, which is simple. What do we ask for? And often we have seen that what they get is tangible, immediate, and it can be converted to dollars and cents.
Right.
What we get is often not binding, best endeavor, after a period of time, not immediate, and the economic value is fuzzy.
Okay.
In FTA, which is the one you talked about, the balance is sought to come through this $100 billion investment. Now, that is not, governments don't invest, companies invest.
Private companies,
And
yes. Yeah.
foreign countries generally say that it's a technology and investment is a corporate level decision, we don't get into it. So again, it is my hope that this happens, but the FTAs are weak instruments in guaranteeing investment, especially if you don't have an investment chapter as you don't have an FTA.
Okay.
So we will find out in the next 10 years, but I worry that some of the promises of investment may not come true.
Okay. All right.
And the balance of the agreement may hence be affected.
Right. So, yeah, and it's important to ask this because it was this government that, when it came to power, as you mentioned earlier, it kind of, put out this review for why India's FTA utilization remains low and scrap the bilateral investment treaties. So, naturally, the second generation FTAs that we are now doing also sort of, create this anticipation that, okay, now we have learned from the past mistakes and now we won't be, repeating them. So, I'm sure a lot of these questions will be answered in time. Now, let us now address the elephant in the room, which is that we also have a thriving economic relationship with the United States of America. And when Donald Trump came to power, everybody in India was happier thinking that we are going to have a smoother conversation with this particular administration compared to the Democrat administration. And Donald Trump, made it very clear that India is a tariff abuser, blah, blah. And then he also levied tariffs on us. Right now, as I understand, and if I understand correctly, he has told us that we need to reduce the trade surplus that we have with the United States. Now, as far as I gather, we have already agreed that we are going to be buying more hydrocarbons from the US. We'll also be perhaps buying more military equipment from the US. And still, there seems to be this FTA looming, over us that we need to finalize before the Quad Summit in September, October this year. What kind of concessions are we going to give more to the US? And why do you think that it seems as if this is an unequal economic relationship where we don't really seem to have too much room to maneuver?
Let me step back.
Okay.
And it's true that this government, when it came to power, had a negative view on FTAs. But I think they've realized that trade is an engine of growth, along with investment and consumption. And for India, the trade engine was not firing. The multilateral initiatives were not delivering because of the problem with the WTO. So we needed to do bilateral trade deals, which were ambitious, which gave us market access to our companies, which enabled us to integrate in areas at least where we were comfortable, in sectors and industry, in areas where we were comfortable. So they have started going on the FTA route, which I think is a very good sign. The problem of doing FTAs with major economic powers is what I have mentioned. It's difficult to find a balance. They will seek tariff reductions, in the name of reciprocal tariffs or whatever. What do we seek? I have always held that India, with its size and economic heft, can do meaningful and beneficial trade deals, FTAs, with almost all countries of the world, except with China and US.
Okay.
Now,
Yeah.
the government took a wise decision of walking out of RCEP, which was basically an FTA with China, giving them access to 80% of our trade lines and trade value, and which would have meant the death knell of industrial sectors. A number of them were Chinese, have the scale, they have the clout, and they have established industry and products.
And at this stage, let me just remind the viewers that he was our chief negotiator for RCEP.
No, but they took the decision to withdraw well after I had moved on and I was ambassador in the WTO, but I think it was a great decision in national interest.
Okay.
The reason why I say, so China is the factory of the world. It produces 80% of textiles, 70% of washing machines, air conditioners, shoes. Now, how do you compete with that scale? The EV company BYD is setting up a factory in Guangzhou, which is 50 square miles, 5 miles by 10 miles. It's supposedly the size of San Francisco City. Will produce 100,000 vehicle, will 100 or million vehicles every year, employ 2.6 lakh people. I mean, that's the scale they work on.
Right.
So it's a problem for our industry, and so we walked out of RCEP.
Okay.
With the US, it insists on gold standard FTAs, where the rules are a problem.
Okay.
They asked for rules on digital trade, on IPRs, on environment, on labor, all of which are problems for us.
Okay.
And they are open as far as tariffs are concerned and services are concerned, so we can't get anything there. So what do we do in FTA with the US for?
Exactly.
So it's basically a question of it's like boxes in a ring. You can't put a middleweight person with a super heavyweight person. And that's what is when we negotiate
Yeah.
an FTA with China or with the US.
Okay.
But now, because of this narrative of reciprocal tariffs,
Yeah.
which I must say is a very unfair narrative, and
Yeah.
I worry that we have not taken the trouble to correct this narrative.
Because I also find it very surprising. I mean, we were just discussing, right? I mean, this behavior by the Trump administration is pretty much like a bully behavior. They try to bully everybody. But as far as I saw, Canada, Mexico, the European Union, they put the tariffs on everybody, China. But, India did not say anything about that. All of these stood up. Why do you think that happened?
See, the narrative of Mr. Trump is
Uh-huh.
that the US has been taken for a ride
Yeah.
because others have entitlements of higher tariffs and they don't. But this is only part of the story.
Yes.
See, we have paid for the entitlement of our tariffs
Yeah.
in the form of agriculture subsidy entitlements. So they have US, Europe, Japan, and others
Yeah.
for agreeing to the TRIPS agreement, the services agreement. So we've
Right.
paid for this.
Okay.
It's not that by a sleight of hand we've increased our tariffs and they're suffering because
Yeah,
of
it's
that.
not a free lunch. It's not freeloading.
And it's
Yeah.
not that they have been shortchanged by the existing trading system.
Okay.
The US, which was the creator, protector, defender, promoter of the rules-based system of the WTO,
Yeah.
has benefited immensely.
Yeah.
The per capita income of the US was 60% of Japan when the WTO came into being, and now it's 1.5 times of Japan.
Right.
They have done very well. If you look at the market cap, 8 of the top 10 companies by market cap are US platforms.
Right.
In services, in digital, in
Yeah.
data, they've done very well.
Yeah.
So, putting yourself and seeking sympathy as one that has been wrong is a wrong narrative, and I think India should have corrected it.
Yeah.
The best time to correct it was when it started. The second best time is now.
Yeah.
And now the government, though, because it is in a negotiation with the US, perhaps can't do it directly. You don't talk to your interlocutor through the press. But our media, our export promotion councils, our institutions, the institutions of the global south like BRICS, etc., they need to correct this narrative that this is something, high tariffs entitlements is something which we've paid for.
Okay.
Be that as it may, they are wanting reciprocal tariffs, and we have to negotiate an FTA, which I believe is not the best thing for us. So we should try to do a bilateral trade deal, which is limited. It's only a tariff deal rather than having a grand, macro, overarching FTA, including agriculture, which Secretary Lutnick talks about.
Yes. Yeah.
A tariff deal with the US we can do, and we can calibrate tariffs in such a way that they get market access in some of the areas which are important to us. We retain market access in some of the areas which are there, and we protect our sensitivities in areas like dairy and poultry and food grains and cotton and other other areas of interest to farmers.
Right. But there's also something very interesting happened, a couple of days when the WTO notified that India indeed has informed the WTO that they are going to be imposing tariffs on US imports, which is like worth $7.6 billion worth of US imports, in a way of retaliating against what the US did to our steel, etc., etc. Now, what is the meaning of this messaging also coming at a time now? And does it hold any technical ground?
So India is joining the rest of the countries
Okay.
against whom the US has imposed tariffs
Okay.
by retaining its right to suspend concessions
Okay.
as a retaliatory measure.
Yeah.
For that, you have to give a notice of the WTO, which we have given.
Yeah.
You have to give it in 90 days.
But we have not given it.
Now, that's not clear
Okay.
whether we have given it within 90 days or we have given it after 90 days. And if it's after 90 days, why is it, etc. That
Okay.
we will have to know. But we have, in this era of lawlessness, perhaps a late notice is also better than no notice.
Okay.
So we are trying to preserve our right to retaliate
Okay.
to the extent of whatever the amount which we lose because of tariffs on steel and aluminum. So that is what that measure is. But, the issue often comes out whether when you're dealing with a big power like the US, with whom you have a geopolitical relationship. You have
Yes.
important geopolitical alliances. The relationship is much more than trade.
Yes.
Should we retaliate? Should we criticize, etc., etc.? So that is, of course, I mean, our negotiators, the Ministry of Commerce and the MEA is well equipped to decide on that.
Okay.
But I do think that institutions and the media should correct some of the narratives which are wrongly being churned out.
Okay.
That the US is wronged and therefore they are seeking reduction in tariffs. That's not the case.
Okay.
If an FTA can be useful for both if negotiated rightly and fairly, and that's where we should be coming from.
No, I'm glad you elaborated that way when it came to the United States and what we are trying to do, like, for example, the trade deal that we are trying to cut with them. But do you also think that this has like an overall bearing on, pushing India's FTA and long-standing FTA with the EU? Because that is a different beast in its own way. It has three parts. It has a FTA in goods and services, it is a bilateral investment treaty and a separate treaty on geographic indicators. Then there's also very stringent carbon border adjustment mechanism, that seems to not go down well on the Indian side. But why I ask you this question is that the ones that we have negotiated with the UK and the FTA, and the one that we are now negotiating, which is with the US, and now the other one which is pending, do you think that there will be a case for better convergence because of all the strategic and economic instability that Donald Trump seems to have perpetuated in the world at large? So do you think that kind of pushes the case for India-EU FTA?
Absolutely.
Okay.
EU is a very important trade partner, has been and will continue to be.
Okay.
And this FTA is near closure. There are few issues to be ironed out before it can close. So we need to push along in that. As far as the India-US FTA is concerned, one of the objectives of President Trump is to reduce the US trade deficit. So we are not likely to get market access. We are not likely to get an increase in exports, even when this deal is done. So we have to look at other markets for exports, and EU is one of the markets.
Yeah.
However, the shadow of the FTAs we do in the past falls on those we do in the future.
It creates a precedent, right? So my worry is that if we settle for less, then other partners will always push us to settle for less.
While there is each FTA is bespoke, and there are, the gives and takes are different depending upon the structure of the economy, the competitive advantage, and so on and so forth. But yes, the EU would certainly look at what we've committed to UK,
Yes.
and the US will look at this also, and that becomes a template.
Okay.
That becomes a base level which they would like to pocket and ask for more.
Okay.
Now, we've made concessions to the UK in auto,
Yes.
and EU, especially Germany, is an auto superpower, large cars, so they will ask for that. Government procurement is something which is part of the EU discussion, so they will ask for what we've given to UK, perhaps more. And in IPs, etc. also.
Right.
And the same goes for the US.
Right.
So this is something which we have to be prepared for,
Okay.
that when we are committing something in government procurement to the UK, it is likely to be asked by others, including our old FTA partners like Japan and Korea and others.
Correct.
In course of time.
Yeah.
So it does the opening kind of liberalization cascades with time.
Okay.
And that's what happens in FTAs, and we need to be prepared for.
Okay.
Also, our market access, it's both ways.
Yeah.
So what market access we get in one place, we can ask others. If US can give us market access, the EU can also give us, UK can also give us. So it's both ways.
Right.
But we need to be sensitive to our concerns, and these are large powers, huge economies, and we need to show that we continue to protect our basic industries like auto, like pharma, our agriculture sector,
dairy,
agriculture, dairy, which are key sectors, and huge livelihoods depend on these sectors.
But just as a last, thing now, because all this sort of connects to how this then translates into the larger effort at de-risking from China, building more resilience in global supply and production chains. And I asked you specifically because even after all this, India is still not really able to emerge as a manufacturing hub. So How do you connect these dots? I mean, in short, of course, because this could be a different discussion altogether, but just as to sort of conclude and let the audiences also have like a key takeaway.
Now, after the first Trump trade war in 2018 to 2024, I mean, the effects of that, the narrative that China has suffered or exports have gone down is not correct.
Yeah, true.
Direct exports from China to the US went down by about 6 percentage points. But total exports of China to the world increased from 16% to 17% between 2018 and 24.
That was just rerouting. Yeah.
So China has been able, by directed investments and trade agreements, reroute some of its exports to a number by extending global value chain. So when the direct exports from China to the US went down by 6 percentage points, 2 percentage points increase in Vietnam, Mexico. I mean, this was why 2% in Mexico, 1% in Vietnam, a little bit in Taiwan, Canada, South Korea, 0.5% in India. So these countries benefited.
Okay.
So the value chains got extended with interposition of countries. But the Chinese anchoring of those exports and the proportion of value in those exports to the US from China did not go down.
Right.
A very graphic example, Vietnam exported $6 billion worth a month to US during this period. It went up by the exports of Vietnam to the US went up by $6 billion a month. In the same time, the exports from China to Vietnam went up by $7 billion a month.
Of course, yes.
Mirror
yes,
image.
Yes.
So the use of tariffs to hurt Chinese exports have not been successful.
Okay.
Also, the China plus one policy has not been very successful.
That's
China
right.
has been able to develop manufacturing exports hub in Mexico and in many of these Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah.
India, I mean, we lament that a lot of investment has been migrating from China to Southeast Asia. Why doesn't it come to India?
Yeah.
And the reason for that is internal.
Yeah.
You know, we have banned investment from China
Yeah.
into India through the press note 3 of 2020. That prohibited, and now that we are reducing those prohibitions or removing those prohibitions and taking a more calibrated approach, some of the investment from there may come to India. But whether it is reducing exports from China to the US or China plus one, it's not really worked.
So,
And I suspect that China has prepared over the last 5 years. It will be even less successful in Trump 2.0.
So, just the final thing that I'd like to pick your brains on: do you think Donald Trump has some hidden strategic genius when it comes to handling China and the world trade, or do you think he's just being the bully that he is?
President Trump is very transactional. He doesn't believe in win-win. He wants a win for the US.
Yeah.
And more importantly, he wants it to be seen as a win for his political constituency.
He's
and the
always
world.
in a hurry.
He wants to declare victory, you know.
Always in a hurry to declare
Yeah.
victory.
So, I mean, that's a difficult interlocutor to deal with.
Yeah.
And but there we do not have a choice. The Chinese, I think, again, have learned how to handle the US.
What can India observe and learn from what is going on and sort of imbibe better for our trade negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion. And see, firstly, we need to correct the narrative that it's not that the US has been wronged, and that is to be corrected through this trade agreement, but it is a trade agreement which has to be mutually beneficial.
Okay.
2, US is known to sign trade agreements and then renege, as they did with the USMCA with Canada and Mexico. So we need to have clauses which allow us to claw back.
Okay.
If they do not honor, we also do not honor
Yeah.
the letter and the spirit of the agreement. We can make concessions for items of agriculture items, small agriculture items of interest to them, pistachios and almonds and berries and bourbon and so on. So we does not make that. And we should simultaneously seek zero tariffs for exports like rice and seafood, some light chemicals, some auto, pharmaceuticals, etc.,
Right.
which are important to us. And sensitivities we need to protect,
Okay.
as we mentioned, in areas like agriculture, dairy, poultry, which will cost us huge livelihoods if we open up to
Right.
the US.
Okay.
I mean, and we keep the agreement narrow. Do not get into rules which might take away our right to put duties on electronic transmissions, to localize data,
Okay.
to use it, to use India's data for India's development, to retain our patent restrictions which do not allow evergreening of patents, do not agree to labor rules which help us maintain our labor arbitrage, which is the basis of our competition,
Okay.
and do not get into accepting sustainable development measures, like the CBAM in the case of EU,
Yeah.
which can nullify the market access we get. I mean, you may negotiate reduction in tariffs, but if on the basis of a sustainable development or an environmental measure like CBAM, they impose tariffs, we lose the market access. So these are some aspects we need to keep in mind while we negotiate, and I'm sure our negotiators are up to it and doing so.
So, well, on that note, I have to thank you, Ambassador Deepak, for taking the time out and also walking us through such very complex terrain, because of course, it's a technical subject in itself, and also it has a lot of I would say strategic flavoring added to it, and especially in the times that we live in. So we have to sort of really have somebody like you who has been negotiating on the behalf of India as to how to navigate these very complex trade agreements. So thank you so much for joining us in person, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.